Okay, we should be recording now. Hello. I'm glad you all could be with us today. We're going to be continuing our lesson on functions, which I'm really excited about. If you weren't here on Tuesday, that's okay. We just talked a little bit about functions and we'll be continuing that today. So as always, here are rules and expectations for the class. Please do stay muted if you're not speaking and use the raise hand button. You may notice we're going to try something different today. So not too different. You may notice that you may not be able to unmute yourself on Zoom. That's just because we've had a little bit of an issue, and it's not everyone, it's not a big deal, but I get distracted if people unmute and I'm not expecting it. Part of having an autistic instructor, I guess. But so we're going to keep it to where I can unmute you. And so if you have a question, use the raise hand button, and then I'll unmute you when I see the raise hand button, and you'll shoot to the top of my screen. So please do continue to ask questions. Of course, you can type chats at any time. We're just going to try this out and see if that helps a little bit. Okie doke. So I'm going to go to where we left off with functions. We had talked about defining and calling our functions. And as a review, functions are bits of code that we can write and then tell Python how to do it. We say, this is a function. I want this to do this task. When I type this, it means do this. And then we can save that in our code and use it again and again within the same code. These are called functions. So first, we define a function. You may have seen this before. We have this def keyword. Def my function. It's whatever you name your function. We'll talk about how to name them in a little bit. Then you'll have these open and close parentheses. Talk about what those mean a little bit too, and a colon. Like a lot of the things in Python, we're going to use a colon, and then everything after that colon that we want within our function, we're going to indent. So we have some indented code here. These are just comments that I put here. This is us defining our function, this entire chunk here. That's defining the function, telling Python when I write, my function, this is what I'm telling you to do. But this doesn't actually call the function. It won't actually do what is inside this code here because this is just a set of instructions and we haven't actually said go yet. It's kind of like when you're playing Simon Says and you give some instructions, but you haven't said Simon Says. So here's our Simon Says. We're saying here's the function. Now I'm telling you to do it. So this is me explaining to Python what I want it to do, and then I say the magic word and it does it. So defining the function and calling the function. We also talked about the main function. This is not, the word main isn't anything special. It's just a convention that you'll see in pretty much all Python work. If you look at packages that people have written or anything that people have written in Python, a lot of them will have this main function. And this is just typically used to define the main body of code. In some of my other coding classes in the past, I have started with this main function, told people that whenever they write code, encapsulate it in a main function. And I don't explain what that is until we get to functions. So some people just start off doing it and may not even know what it is. So I'll show you this example here. So up top, this is just an example of a replit file. I have def main, define main, indent all of the code that I want to be associated with my function. And then we're going to call the function. And it's very important, don't indent that function call or else it'll be part of the function itself. And the function is calling itself and you never actually call the function. Nope. Make sure it's outside. It's lined up with this here. So this is actually what lets the code run. So if I do this, it'll say print hello. There it goes. If I get rid of this here, if I just define the function and I don't call it at the bottom, it does nothing. The number one error that I see beginning coders make, and even experienced coders, the number one error that I see is they will define their function. They'll have def main, they'll write all of this code, they'll have lines and lines and lines of amazing code, and then that's it. And they don't call main at the bottom, and then they run their code and they say, help, my code doesn't run. I don't know what the error is. There's no error message. And that's because you didn't call main. So first step, if you have an error and your code's not running, check if you called your function. Did you call your main function? Okay, so that is our wrap up of functions here, just our brief overview. One other thing that I wanted to point out is we cannot call main up here before we define it. If we do that, Python doesn't know what this is. Remember, it goes line by line. So if I call this, it's going to say Name main is not defined. Did you mean min? Because it's trying to come up with another function, and min is a built-in function on Python. So you can't call a function before you define it, much like you can't use variables before you define them. Okay, so any questions on functions so far? I muted myself again. All right. Oh, David. Oh, and I will, okay. Does this work? If I ask?
I noticed that it's possible to use a function in the body of another function whose definition occurs earlier.
Yes.
Even though it's not defined by the time that function is defined.
Right.
Are there any surprising rules around that, or is it just sort of what you'd expect?
Yeah, so what David is saying is that we could have this other function. Oh, here, I'll put it down here. We could say, def other function, and then say this one is print hiya. And then in our main function, we could have this where, oops. Oh, I got rid of some quotes. We could have, call our other function within this function. And that looks a little strange, but then when we call main, what it's going to do is go up to main and then print other function. So let's see what happens. And it does it. So I guess Python, and I haven't looked into the specifics of what this does, but it's going to read this. It's going to say, okay, I'm going to call this other function. It keeps going down because it's not calling it yet. We define a separate function, and then we call main, and it has all the information that it needs. As far as other things that are surprising, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but if I think of some, I will let you know. Did that answer your question, David?
Yes.
Okay.
there's a double step unmute because you have to ask me to unmute, and then I have to say yes.
Yeah,
maybe there's a way
sorry
to
about that.
Fix that. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, and if you want to, I don't know, we'll figure it out. I just wanted to try this out, see if that works. Okay. Good question. Okay, so that is, we're talking about main function. All right, other things about naming functions. So you get to name your function. Oh, and I think I might have frozen. If you could still hear me, can you put in the chat? Oh, I think I'm back. Okay, you didn't miss anything if I did freeze. I was just trying to figure out if I was frozen or not. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, to me it looks like I froze. So for naming functions, you get to name your function, but there are a few rules that you have to follow. First of all, function names have to start with letters. They can't start with numbers, and they can only contain alphanumeric values and underscores. You may see underscores a lot, like with my function, I have my underscore function. It also must have the open and close parentheses at the end, whether or not we're actually going to use those parentheses for arguments, which I'll talk about later. All functions have those open and close parentheses at the very end. That's part of how you can identify a function, is if when you call it, you have the open close parentheses. So if we wanted to create a function, call it a say hello, say underscore hello, we would say def say underscore hello, open and close parentheses, and our colon, don't forget that. And then all code inside this function is indented. Say we want it to print hello. And then if we wanted to call this, because this doesn't do anything on its own, if we want to call it, we go outside of that indentation block and we call our function by saying say underscore hello with those parentheses, and it will use our function and print hello, just as we wanted to do. So naming functions has to start with letters and only contain either letters, numbers, or underscore. Nothing else besides that. Those are just how Python dictates. So arguments. So when we talk about those open and closing parentheses, that's where we're talking about we can put what are called arguments. These are defined in the function definition. So you choose arguments, you put them inside the parentheses, and then the function can use those arguments as variables. So what this will look like is if we wanted a function called say hello, and we want it to have a variable within it called name that we can change every time we call the function. When you call this function, you're going to put that name in there. So we have define a function called say hello. It takes an argument called name, and then we're going to print hello, comma, and then name. So we're going to print whatever the user puts into these parentheses here. So if we call say hello and then Miranda, it's going to call the function and say hello, Miranda. And it includes that argument. So let's try that up here. So if I have a function, I'm going to do the say hello one. So say hello, and then I'm just going to type name. That's going to be the variable that it's going to use in here. So now if I say print, oops, hello, and then name. So now outside here, when I call this, I can say hello, and then the name that I wanted to use is Miranda. When I run this, it's hello, Miranda. We could change this. We could say hello, George. We'll say hello, George. Anything like that. We can even call this multiple times. So you can call any function multiple times. It'll just keep going because this is where we're actually telling it to use the function. So this is where we have arguments. So that's called an argument. We could have another one that's, let's say def add num. I'm going to say num1 and num2. So I'm writing a function that takes in two numbers and then adds them. I'm going to say print num1 plus num2. And now if I call add nums, I can tell it what numbers I want. So I called add nums with 1 and 3, and then it printed out. It used this, it assigned 1 to num1 and 3 to num2. So we can have as many as we want as long as we separate these with commas. Let me go back. I'm pretty sure I explained that on the next slide. Sometimes I get ahead of my slides. So more than one argument separated by commas, just as I was saying. So with the say hello example, we have say hello, and then we have an option to specify a greeting, and then an option to specify name. So you name these arguments, you as the programmer come up with what they're called. So what we typically do is we try to make the arguments that we send here self-explanatory. So we want the name to make sense. So I have this function called say hello, and I see it takes an argument called greeting and an argument called name. And because of the function name being say hello, this argument called greeting, this argument called name, I can guess before I even look at the code that this function will take a greeting and then print the greeting as well as printing the name. And so it kind of makes a customized greeting to someone. So now if we call this, and we can see inside here that that is correct, it's going to print the greeting and then the name. So we can call this say hello, and I want it to be hello and Miranda. And we're going to separate those arguments by commas. And these arguments are assigned in order. So if I had done something silly, remember Python isn't going to look at what you're naming these arguments. So even though you say, I'm going to send it in order of greeting and name, and then we print greeting, comma, name. Now, if I call say hello, whatever I put in first is going to be assigned to the greeting argument. So even if I put in, Miranda and then, blah or something, it's not going to put it in whatever order. So if I said, Miranda and hello, This is getting assigned to greeting because it's the first in this list here. And then this hello is getting assigned to name. So you need to be careful that you put these in the exact order that you define them. So really all this is doing is saying print two variables that the user specifies up here. So instead, if I do this, it is now in the order that I wanted. And another thing that we need is you must, if there are arguments at all in a function, you have to assign or put in, it's called assigning an argument when I put in, hello, comma, Miranda, you must assign all the arguments or Python is going to throw an error. So apologies to be switching back and forth so much. If I just said say hello, and I did not include any of I didn't include this second argument here, I run this, and now Python says missing one required positional argument. So it tells you exactly what's wrong. It says, say hello, this function is missing one positional argument, name. So it's saying, hey, I have greeting, but I don't have name. So then you have to put that in. Same thing happens if I just say hello, and I don't put any arguments in. This asks for 2 arguments, I don't put any in. Now it's going to say missing 2 required arguments, greeting and name. So it's just saying, hey, you actually have to fill something in here, or else this function isn't able to fill this in. Okay, so I got ahead of my slides and I already did this example. Takes 2 numbers as arguments and adds them. Let's try 3 numbers and multiply them. So if I were going to write a function, okay, so what do I start with? So I'm going to write a function that takes 3 numbers and multiplies them. So what do I need? Go ahead and put in the chat. What should my very first line be? And you can make up the name of the function. So if we're going to define a function here, put in the chat, how are we going to do this? Just the first line. And we want it to take in 3 numbers. Awesome, we've got an answer here. Thank you so much. So yes. So I'm gonna take Xavier's answer that they gave us, and I'm gonna say def multi 3. That's a good name, multiply 3. Multi 3, and then we're gonna take num1, comma, num2, comma, and num3, and then we can't forget this colon. So there we go. So define our function. It's gonna be called multi 3, num1, num2, num3. And so now I'm gonna say print num1 times, actually I'm gonna split this out. I'm gonna say answer equals num1 times num2 times num3. Then I'm gonna say print answer. And now we can test this and call it. So multi, let's say 1, 3, 5. So now we run this, oops. Name multi is not defined, oops, multi 3. 15, which was correct. So we can put in, we can call this again, multi 3, say 4, 5, 0. Call it again, and it will do both of these function calls that we wrote. And just to reiterate, if you forget one of these numbers, you don't add it in there, it's going to give you an error. Awesome. Yep, and I got some other answers too. Great job. Okay, yep, so we define it, we have our colon there. All of our code goes indented inside of the function, and then we call it outside of that indent. Great job. Okay. Back to the slideshow. So another example, write a function that takes as arguments a message and a number and print the message n times. So I want you to try this on your own and then put your code for me in the chat. So go ahead and put in the chat, how would you write a function that takes these arguments, a message and a number, and then prints the message that number of times? How would we write that function? Put that in the chat if you would. Here we go. Got some answers. Thank you. Thank you. Okie doke, you're totally fine. That's why we're practicing. So go ahead, come up with how you would write this function, put it in the chat. I'll wait a couple more minutes so that everyone has a chance to practice. So we'll be writing a function that takes these arguments and then prints that message this number of times. And if you're struggling with part of it, you can just send me what you have and we can go over it. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Go ahead and put in the chat if you have something. Thank you for everyone that has sent me your answers. All right, let's try this one together. Oops. Okay, so back over here. So we want to get a message and a number. So I'm going to say define. I'm going to call mine print message. I'm going to have a message argument and n, the number of times I want it to print. Don't forget that colon. Also, another thing that I see a couple of people doing, and this could be because of the Zoom chat, but I want to make sure there's no space here. There's no space between the function name and these parentheses. That is how Python knows that these parentheses go with this function. So make sure that there's no space. You just have your function name, parentheses. Okay, so we've defined this and now we've indented. I want to print that message n number of times. So a couple of you did a bit of a different solution than I was imagining, but it is totally correct and probably a better way than I was imagining it. So all that you need to do is just print that message the number of times. So you can just say print string, oops, yeah, print message times n. So I just meant you just print it that number of times. And so you can multiply a string and it'll print it that many times. Totally fine. Some of you did a for loop, which I'll go over as well. I love that you're thinking about loops. So I'm going to print hello and then 3 times. So if I test this, hello, hello, hello. So that is one way of doing it. I saw other answers in here that were using for loop, which is great. So let's try that. So some people said for I in range 0 to n, colon, indent again, gonna print message. And so this is gonna print each message on a separate line. So if we did this, and then we call our function with print message, hello 3, we're gonna print that 3 times on separate lines. Great job, everyone. Okie doke. So now we've talked about the arguments where you specify them each time, but you can also set default values. That way, if someone forgets to input any arguments, it has a default value that they don't have to set each time. This is really useful if you expect one argument to be the same every time. Like for our greeting, if we expect the greeting to be hello most of the time, we can specify that the default value for that greeting is hello. So this is a way to set that default value in your function definition. So you're going to use the assignment operator within the parentheses to assign your default value. Default arguments, though, have to be listed last. So if you have arguments that that don't have a default value, then those go first, the names, and then if you have a default argument value, that is listed last, which I'll show you. Then that makes that argument optional because it has that fallback value in case the user doesn't enter it. It's totally fine. Python says its default value is this. So if we have say hello, we can put name because the name will probably change each time. And this is arbitrary which one you choose to be default. It's just you as the programmer, you get to decide. I think this one will probably have a default value of this just based on the way that I want it to be used. So we have name. And then we say greeting equals hello. So this is just saying there's another argument called greeting. If the user inputs nothing, greeting is hello, but whatever they input, that overrides it. So now we have print greeting name, and we can call it just with the one required argument. So we have name, greeting has the default value of hello. So now when we just enter name, you don't enter anything else, we're no longer going to get an error. It's going to automatically assign this greeting to be hello. So if we try this out, so we have defined say hello. I'm going to have the argument name, and then I'm going to say greeting equals the string hello, just because I'm saying the default greeting for this function is hello. Now I'm going to print greeting and name. So when we go to call this function, we can say hello, open our parentheses up. I'm going to give the name Miranda, and I'm not going to put anything else in there, and it should have this default value that we assigned up here. So if I run this, it says hello, Miranda. But if we do want to change the default, we can do that just as normal. It will be assigned in order. So we have Miranda. If I put another argument in here, and I say, Guten Tag, then it says Guten Tag, Miranda. So whatever the user inputs takes precedence, but if they input nothing, it's assigned to this default value. So we can have Guten Tag, we make it whatever we want. You can also directly specify it. So let's say we had 2 optional arguments. So let's say, by default, we want name to also be Miranda. Then you have to specify which argument you are talking about. So in this case, what I changed was I made both of these have default values, name equals Miranda, greeting equals hello. Now when I input this, I need to specify name equals Isaac and greeting equals Ola. And now when I do that, it says Ola, Isaac. That's my husband's name. He's sitting next to me. Okay, so we can specify these default values, and then we can say what we want to override them with when we call the function ourselves. So let me get rid of this default value. Now, if I have this and it doesn't have a default, Python usually doesn't like that. Oh, it took it just fine. So as long as, I think it's because both of them were like that. Okay, anyway, with this default greeting, again, I can put in whatever name I want. Cloud is the name of my cat, and I'll say hello, Cloud. Okay, and I see why last? Python. Answer is Python. Because if you have, like, let's say our function takes, name, greeting, number of, or in, just like we did last time, like number of times. If you have an argument that needs a default value, it has to be last. So if you have multiple ones, like let's say the number of times we're going to set as default is 3, then name needs to be first, and then these default ones need to be last. So if we were doing something like print, so for I in range 0 to n, just like we did last time, don't forget to tab this print greeting and name. So this is going to print this a certain number of times. Let's say we have a default value of 3. So it's going to do that 3 times. And then if we want to specify the number of times, we need to say in here, we want to set n to 10. And we don't have to specify greeting still. But now it's going to print it 10 times. It overrode this default value. Let's say we just want to change greeting. So greeting equals hello. We don't specify the number of times. It's going to default to 3. And then if we say greeting equals hello and n equals 5, then it will take both of these. But as for why you define them last, it's just because Python. And yes, that will work. Yes, so if you don't specify this, you can put them in whatever order down here. So yes, that is correct. I typically like when there's more than one to specify which one I am talking about, just because when you have a lot of arguments, it's easy to get lost. So if we added another one that said like, other string equals hello, I don't know, something like that. When you have a lot of arguments, it can get confusing. So I always put this equal sign here when I'm calling it. You don't necessarily need it as long as all of these are, you have them in the same order that you want them. But if I do this, now I can call it and say greeting equals hello, even though n comes first, then I can say n equals 1. So you can switch up that order here if you specify which variable you're talking about. Oh, yes. Okay. I see what you're saying. Awesome. So any questions so far, please do raise your hand or type into the chat. I use my question asking solicitation for a chance to drink water so that it's not awkward silence, at least for me. Take a water break. Okay. So just another example right here. Oops. And say hello, name. We have a greeting with a default value. We can just put in Miranda here, or we can put in Miranda and then our own personal greeting that we want. Okay, so some function examples. Rewrite an earlier function to set a default value for an argument. We kind of already did that with our greeting one. Okay, so far, our functions have only run code and then they end when our code stopped. So that's nice. It does a thing and then it stops. That's totally fine. Usually we're putting a print statement there if we want the function to like print something or show us something. But what if we actually want to use, like what if we had really complicated math inside of our function, and then we want to use the results of that math? Printing it is not ideal because maybe you have other calculations you want to use and you don't want to print it to the console just yet. Or maybe you want to have different functions working together. What can you do in that case? Well, we can also have functions communicate with other parts of our code by what are called return statements. So return statement allows functions to send the results to other functions or just to other bits of code within the same Python script. So this is called a return value. A return value can be empty, and this just says end. It's kind of just a way to say this is the end of my function. So with this, we have def my function. Let's say we have some code here, and then at the end I put return. That just means the function ends, and it's just going to return nothing. So it's you can have print statements up above here, but once it gets to this return, it's immediately going to end. Some people do that. You don't necessarily have to if you don't need your function to return anything. But let's say that we want to return a value. So we can say return followed by a value. Okay, this is taking too long. Okay, there we go. My slides caught up to me. So if we say multiply by 2, we write a function that's going to take a number and then multiply that by 2. We can say new number equals number times 2, return new number. Now we're not using that print statement anymore because maybe we want to just save that number as a variable somewhere outside of our function. So you can return that value here. And then I wanted to show you that example before I talked about it. So if you don't give a value, just like in this one here, that's called a void function. It doesn't return anything. It returns void. That's a computer sciencey term that you might hear if you take other programming classes. But return will end the function and then send whatever value there is in the return statement. It'll send that value back to the line that called the function. So we have the define function. And then when we call that function, that line will now have the value of the return statement. So usually you're using that to assign the return from the function to a variable. So if we want to have, a function that does some fancy math, and then we say answer equals function with this fancy math, it'll return that into our variable. I'll explain. So we have this example. So let's say instead of this, we're going to do, def. So we had one that was, adding two numbers. So let's say add have num1 and num2. And so before, oops, don't forget your colon, before we're going to print num1 plus num2. But then when we call add num, we can't really do anything with this. We're just calling it, just going to print something, right? So what's the point? Unless you just want to print something to the screen, you did good, but we can't really like use this for anything else in our code. Let's say we wanted to add two numbers and then we wanted to, I don't know, do something else with it. So in this case, we can, instead of printing that, we can say something like, answer equals num1 plus num2, then still indented, return answer. This is telling Python at the end of this function, the function is going to return whatever this variable equals. So the variable does need to be defined within your function. If it's defined, somewhere over here outside your function, that can cause problems. So make sure whatever you're returning actually happened inside here. Return answer. And now if we say add num, depending on how Replit does this, it may or may not print it. Okay, so it looks like it didn't do anything. So what I was saying about may or may not printing it, depending on the software you're using to run Python, sometimes it will print each line. Replit doesn't do that, which is more useful for our case right now. So we just said add num. We didn't print anything, but if I want to assign a variable to that, I can say, addition equals add num1, 2. And now if I print that addition just to check what that value is, it gives it to me, 3. So this is now saved to the value of our variable here. So it's pretty nifty. So hopefully I saved some more of my complicated, not complicated, but more complex examples. Okay. So here's another example where you have the multiply by 2. We have an argument called number, and then new number equals number times 2, return new number. So now if I want to say, call the function, I'm going to define something called number. Num times 2 equals multiply by 2. And then I'm putting this number up here. So this is just different. This is me putting a variable inside that argument. That's perfectly fine. It would be the same if I just put the number 4. So now I'm assigning the result of the function to a variable, and then I'm going to print out that variable. So right now, it may not make much sense if we're just printing it anyway, but it's typically good to return that value because maybe the user doesn't want to print it. Maybe they want to actually use the result. So just for some practice, let me see, how many do we have left? Oh, okay, not that many. Okay, awesome. So we will go through a couple of these exercises together. We'll go through maybe one of these exercises together, and then you can work on these 2 exercises. Let me see. Okay, sorry, I was just checking what I had here. So if we're going to write a function that takes 2 numbers as arguments, adds them and returns them, I got ahead of myself again. That's what we just did. So let's move on to this one. So write a function that returns true if the number entered is even, or false if the number entered is odd. So what I mean by that wasn't super explanatory. We have def, even or odd num. Okay, so you're going to have a function called even or odd, and then someone's going to enter a number. If that number is even, print even. If it's odd, print odd. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to work on that. Please do put your code as you're working into the chat. You can either put completed code into the chat, or if you got part of the way through, you can put that into the chat. So go here, write a function that returns true if the number is even. So even or odd. Or false if the number is odd. Go ahead and work on that for maybe 5 minutes, and then put it in the chat when you're done. Awesome, awesome. Starting to see some answers come through. Thank you. Yeah, I realized as I typed it out that even or odd doesn't really make sense as the name of the function. So even or odd is fine, but is even is maybe a better name if we're talking about names. Okay, yeah, totally fine if you struggled. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over it. So we want to write a function that is going to return true if the number is even, or return false if the number is odd. Let's go over here. So I'm going to change the function name to is even by suggestion. So is even number. So first we're starting off with defining our function. So we have def, our function name, which I'm calling is even, and then the argument that we're going to take is just a number. And now there's a couple ways to do this, and I saw several ways. So I'm going to go over a couple of them. So one way to do this is you could use if statements. You can say if, and remember how we check if a number is even or odd is we can use that modulo, right? Because that's remainder. So if num mod 2 equals 0, that means it's even, because number mod 2, that's like remainder. What is the remainder when you divide this number by 2? If the remainder is 0, that means that that number is completely divisible by 2, which means it's even. So if num mod 2 equals 0, remember I told you this would come up a lot, this modulo. So if number is even, then you can return true. And then else return false, because there's only one or the other. So you don't really need to say elif or anything. If it's even, return true, else return false. So let's test this. It's always good to test your code. So let's say, print is even 3. This should print false. There we go. If we did is even 4, it should print true. And it does. Amazing, amazing. Now this other way that I saw people doing is this phrase here, num modulo 2 equals 0 will give us a Boolean value. So if it's even, this Boolean value will be equal to true. If it's false, the Boolean value will be equal to false, right? So if we just say return num mod 2 equals 0, it's just going to return whatever this evaluates to. That's kind of a shortcut way of doing it. I love that some of you thought of that. So if we print it for the number 4, we get true. Print it for 11, we get false. All right, so how was that? I saw lots of good answers in here. Okay, and then just to wrap up today, I'm going to give you this as an assignment that we will go over on Tuesday. Write a function that takes a list of numbers as an argument. The function should return a list of Booleans representing for each number whether that number is even. So here's an example input, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the input to the function is a list. The output should be a list that has false if the number is odd and true if the number is even. So this should be false, true, false, true, false, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So false for 1, true for 2, false for 3, true for 4, false for 5. That was hard to say. So this is your homework until we meet back again next class. I'll take the remainder of the class to work on this. So if you'd like to stay and work on this during class, that way you can ask questions, maybe show me your code. Feel free to do that. This is your assignment. Another assignment that I want you to do is to try these exercises from W3 schools. I sometimes like to assign these because they give you little fill in the blanks, which is really nice for some people really like these. So you can say create a function called my function. You can fill in this blank here, click show answer, and then you can see, or submit answer, and you can see if it's correct or not. So there's 4 exercises. I think there's technically 6, but I don't think we have gotten to 5 and 6. So just 1 through 4 should be good. All right, so go ahead and stay around, work on this here. if you are interested, I do have some resources for reading more about functions. If maybe you need a cheat sheet or you just need to read up to understand some more, please stay around, work on this assignment here. Let me know if you have questions. And I will go ahead and stop recording so that you're free to ask questions and work on stuff.